There was once a baker who had a shop in a small town in America. This baker was not a very kind man. He never gave his customers any more bread than necessary for their money, and he never smiled. But he was a very good baker. His bread was the softest bread that you could imagine. Sometimes customers paid for their bread and started eating it there in the shop. And his cakes, his cakes were really delicious. People came to his shop from all over town. When they walked down the street, they smelled the baker's wonderful bread and his delicious cakes, and they walked right into his shop. But not everyone came inside. Some people just stood outside the shop, smelling and looking in through the windows. The baker didn't like this.
Their stomachs are full of the smell of my bread. I'm giving them a free lunch, and I get nothing for my hard work,
he said to himself.
Perhaps there's some way to put those delicious smell in bottles. Then I can sell them, just like I sell my bread.
One winter morning, very early, the baker was in his shop making bread. He wasn't singing happily while he worked. He was complaining to himself about getting up early, about the cold weather, and about anything that came into his head. In the middle of all this, he looked up and saw someone looking in through the window. It was a young man wearing an old coat. He was looking at the baker's bread, and he was hungry. He was smelling the fresh bread and smiling. When the baker saw him, he felt very angry.
That thief outside my shop has a stomach full of the smell of my bread. It's a free breakfast. I get nothing for my hard work, while he steals my smells.
The man didn't move. He just stood there, closed his eyes, and smelt the fresh bread happily. The baker was really angry now.
Pay you for what?
Asked the young man in great surprise.
For the smells that you've stolen,
replied the baker.
But I've stolen nothing. I'm only smelling the air. Air is free,
said the hungry young man.
It's not free when it's full of the smells from my shop,
replied the baker.
Pay me now, or I'll call the police.
When the young man didn't pay, the baker took him by the coat and pulled him through the snow to the judge's house. He knocked on the door. After a long time, the judge opened the door in his night clothes. He looked at the baker and the hungry young man standing outside in the street. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. What could be so important so early in the day?
This man is a thief. He stole the smells from my shop,
said the baker. The judge was surprised, but all he said was,
Come in and tell me your story. But first give me time to dress myself.
He went back into the house. After a few minutes he came back, and he took them inside. They all sat down together round a large table.
All right, tell me everything. Baker, you start,
said the judge. He listened quietly. First the baker told him all about the hungry man who stole all his smells. The judge went on listening. Then the young man told him that air was free, and that any man could have as much as he wanted. When they finished telling their stories, the judge was silent for a few minutes. The baker started telling him again of how the other man took all his smells without paying.
Stop. Be quiet. I've decided what we'll do,
said the judge.
Young man, do you have any money?
The young man put his hand in his pocket and took out a few coins. He showed them to the judge and said,
Sir, this is all the money that I have in the world.
Give those coins to May.
said the judge. The young man put them into the judge's hand.
I've listened carefully to both your stories.
Began the judge.
It's true that the smells were coming out of the baker's shop. And these smells belonged to the baker. And it's also true that this young man took those smells without paying for them. And so I say that the young man has to pay the baker for the smells that he took.
The baker smiled, perhaps for the very first time in his life. He held out his hand at once for the money. But the judge didn't give him the coins.
Baker, listen and listen carefully.
He said. He shook the coins in his hands, and they clinked together.
That can pay for the smells.
He said to the baker.
Give me my coins, sir.
Said the baker, not smiling any more.
No,
Said the judge.
I've decided that the sound of money is the best way to pay for the smell of bread.
And with that, he gave the coins back to the poor young man and told him to go home.
Chapter 1. My story begins. In 1825, I was 10 years old. My father and mother were dead. I lived with my aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Reed. Their house was called Gateshead Hall. The house was in Yorkshire, in the north of England. My aunt and Uncle Reed had 2 children, a boy, John, and a girl, Eliza. I liked my Uncle Reed and he liked me. But in 1825, my uncle died. After that, I was very unhappy. My Aunt Reed did not like me. And John and Eliza were unkind to me. It was a cold, rainy day in December. All of us were in the house. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to read. I opened a book. Then I heard my cousin John's voice.
Jane! Jane Eyre! Where are you?
John shouted. He came into the room and he saw me.
Why are you reading my book?
He asked.
Give it to me.
John took the book. He hit my head with it. I screamed. John hit me again. I pulled his hair and I kicked him.
Help! Help, Mama!
John shouted.
Jane Eyre is hurting me.
Aunt Reed ran into the room. She pulled me away from John.
John hit me with the book.
I said.
I hate him, and I hate you too.
You are a bad girl, Jane.
My aunt said.
Why do you hate me? You don't like me?
I replied.
John and Eliza were unkind to me. I want to leave Gateshead Hall.
You want to leave.
Aunt Reed said.
Where will you go? Your parents are dead. You cannot live alone.
Aunt Reed thought for a moment.
My friend, Mr. Brocklehurst, is the owner of a school.
She said.
I will send you to Mr. Brocklehurst's school.
A few days later, Mr. Brocklehurst came to Gateshead Hall. He was a very tall man. His eyes were dark and his face was cruel.
Jane Eyre,
He said to me.
God does not like bad children. God punishes bad children. Jane Eyre, God will punish John Reed.
I replied.
John Reed is me and he shouts at me.
That is not true. You are a liar, Jane Eyre.
Mr. Brocklehurst said.
You must not tell lies. And you must not live here with your cousins. You will come to Lowood School. You will become a good girl.
I want to come to your school, sir.
I said.
I want to leave this house.
Bad girls are punished at my school, Jane Eyre.
Mr. Brocklehurst said.
The girls work very hard at Lowood.
I will work hard. I will be a good pupil, Mr. Brocklehurst.
I said. 2 weeks later, I left Gateshead Hall. I went to Lowood School. Chapter 2 Lowood School. It was the month of January. I arrived at Lowood School at night. A servant took me up some stairs and into a big bedroom. There were many beds in the room. The girls in the beds were asleep. The servant took me to an empty bed. I put on my night clothes and I got into bed. Soon, I was asleep too. I woke up very early. A loud bell was ringing. The bedroom was dark and cold. I watched the other girls. They washed in cold water and they dressed quickly. There was a plain brown dress next to my bed. And there was a pair of ugly, heavy shoes. I washed quickly. Then I put on my new clothes. I was very hungry. I followed the other girls down the stairs. We sat down at long tables in a large dining room. Our food was terrible.
The food is bad again.
One of the girls said.
Stand up.
A teacher shouted.
Don't talk.
We stood up. We did not speak. We walked into a big schoolroom and we sat down. There were about 80 girls in the schoolroom. And there were 4 classes. The oldest girls were in the 4th class. I was in the 1st class. 4 teachers came into the room and we began our lessons. The lessons were not interesting. First, we read some pages in a book. Then our teacher asked us questions about those pages. After 4 hours, we went outside. It was very cold. Very soon, a bell rang. Lesson started again. 3 weeks passed. One afternoon, the head teacher came into the schoolroom. The head teacher's name was Miss Temple. Mr. Brocklehurst was with her. We all stood up. I stood behind an older girl. I did not want Mr. Brocklehurst to see me. Mr. Brocklehurst walked slowly round the room. Everybody was very quiet. And then I dropped my book. Mr. Brocklehurst stopped walking. He looked at me.
Ah, the new girl.
He said.
Come here, Jane Eyre.
Then he pointed at 2 of the older girls.
You 2 girls put Jane Eyre on that high chair.
He said.
Look at Jane Eyre, everybody.
Mr. Brocklehurst said.
This child is bad. She is a liar. She will be punished. Miss Temple. Teachers. Girls. Do not talk to this child.
Then he spoke to me again.
Jane Eyre, you must stand on that chair for 2 hours.
He said.
You are a bad girl.
That evening, I cried and cried. But Miss Temple was kind to me.
You are a good pupil, Jane.
She said.
And you are not a bad girl. I am your friend, Jane.
Thank you, Miss Temple.
I said. Lowood School was in an unhealthy place. The buildings were wet and cold. Mr. Brocklehurst owned the school. He was a rich man, but he did not buy warm clothes for us. And he did not buy good food for us. Everybody hated him. In the spring, many of the girls became sick. Some of them left the school. They never came back. Many of the girls died. That spring was a terrible time. We had no lessons. Miss Temple and the other teachers took care of the sick pupils. Mr. Brocklehurst had to buy better food for us. And he had to buy warm clothes for us. Mr. Brocklehurst never came to the school. The next year, Lowood School moved to a better place. It was a healthier place. There were new schoolrooms, new bedrooms, and a new dining room. The new buildings were bright and clean. The teachers were happy. After that, I was happy at Lowood School too. I was a pupil at Lowood School for 6 years. Then I became a teacher. I was a teacher at the school for 2 years. But I never returned to Gates at all. And the Reeds never wrote to me. Chapter 3, Thornfield Hall. In 1833, I was 18 years old. In the summer, Miss Temple left Lowood School. She got married. I wanted to leave Lowood too. I wanted a new life.
I will be a governess,
I thought. I put an advertisement in a newspaper. I had a reply to my advertisement. The reply was from Mrs. Fairfax of Thornfield Hall, near Millcote. Millcote was about 70 miles from Lowood School. Mrs. Fairfax wanted a governess for a little girl. I wrote to Mrs. Fairfax immediately. I was going to be a governess at Thornfield Hall. I traveled to Millcote in a coach. At Millcote, a servant met me. He took me to Thornfield Hall. At Thornfield Hall, another servant opened the door. She was smiling. She took me into a small, warm room. A lady was in the room. She was sitting by the fire.
Are you Mrs. Fairfax?
I asked her.
Yes, my dear,
she said.
And you are Miss Eyre. Are you cold? Sit by the fire, Miss Eyre. A servant will bring you some food. Mrs. Fairfax is very kind,
I said to myself.
I will be happy here. Will I see Miss Fairfax tonight?
I asked. Mrs. Fairfax looked at me. She smiled.
Miss Fairfax? No, no,
she said. Your pupil's name is not Miss Fairfax. Your pupil is Adele Varens. Adele's mother was a Frenchwoman. Adele is Mr. Rochester's ward. He takes care of her.
Mr. Rochester? Who is Mr. Rochester?
I asked.
Mr. Edward Rochester is the owner of Thornfield Hall,
Mrs. Fairfax said.
I am his housekeeper. I take care of Thornfield Hall. Mr. Rochester is not here now. He does not like this house. He is often away from home.
I was very tired. Mrs. Fairfax took me up the wide stairs. She took me to my room. I went to bed immediately. And I slept well. The next morning, I woke early. The sun was shining. I put on a plain black dress. I opened my bedroom door. I walked along a corridor and down the wide stairs. I walked out into the sunny garden. I turned and I looked up at my new home. Thornfield Hall was a beautiful house with many large windows. The garden was beautiful too. After a few minutes, Mrs. Fairfax came into the garden. She spoke to me.
Good morning, Miss Eyre,
she said.
You have woken early. Miss Adele is here. After breakfast, you must take her to the schoolroom. She must begin her lessons.
A pretty little girl walked towards me. She was about 8 years old. She spoke to me in French and I replied in French. After breakfast, I took Adele to the schoolroom. We worked all morning. Adele enjoyed her lessons and I was happy. In the afternoon, Mrs. Fairfax took me into all the rooms of Thornfield Hall. We looked at the paintings and at the beautiful furniture. We walked along the corridors.
Come up onto the roof, Miss Eyre.
Mrs. Fairfax said.
You will see the beautiful countryside around Thornfield Hall.
We walked up many stairs. At last, we were at the top of the house. We walked along the top corridor. Mrs. Fairfax opened a small door and we walked onto the roof.
Look, Miss Eyre.
Mrs. Fairfax said.
You can see for many miles.
We stood on the roof for a few minutes. Then we went back into the house. We walked carefully towards the stairs. The top corridor was narrow and dark. Suddenly, I heard a strange laugh.
Who is that, Mrs. Fairfax?
I asked. Mrs. Fairfax did not reply. She knocked on a door.
Grace,
she said. The door opened. Behind the door was a small room. A servant was standing at the door.
Be quiet, Grace, please,
Mrs. Fairfax said. The woman looked at Mrs. Fairfax. Then she closed the door.
That was Grace Pooley,
Mrs. Fairfax said.
She works up here. Sometimes she laughs and talks with the other servants. Don't worry about Grace. Please come downstairs now, Miss Eyre.
Chapter 4, Mr. Rochester. 3 months passed. I had not met the owner of Thornfield Hall. Mr. Rochester had not come home. One January afternoon, I went out and I walked towards the road. I was going to the village of Eyre. I was going to post a letter in the village. Eyre was 2 miles from Thornfield Hall. The day was fine, but it was very cold. I walked quickly and soon I was near the village. Suddenly, a big black and white dog ran past me. A moment later, a man on a black horse followed the dog. Then, I heard an angry shout. The dog ran past me again. It was barking loudly. I turned round. The horse had fallen on the icy ground and the man had fallen from the horse. One walked towards them.
Can I help you, sir?
I asked.
My horse fell. I've hurt my foot.
The man said. The horse stood up. The man tried to stand up too. But he could not stand. He fell onto the ground again. The man was about 35 years old. He was not handsome, but he had a strong face. He had dark eyes and black hair. He was not very tall, but his body was powerful.
I'll bring somebody from Thornfield Hall,
I said.
Do you live at Thornfield?
The man asked.
I am the governess,
I replied.
Yes, the governess.
The man said.
Help me, please.
The man stood up very slowly, and he put his hand on my shoulder. He walked slowly towards his horse. I helped him. He pulled himself onto the horse.
Thank you. Now go home quickly,
the man said. And he rode away. I walked onto the village and I posted my letter. Then I returned to Thornfield Hall. Bright lights were shining in the big house. I went inside. A big black and white dog walked towards me. It came from the dining room. I had seen the dog before.
Whose dog is that?
I asked a servant.
It's Mr. Rochester's dog,
the servant replied. Mr. Rochester has come home. But he has hurt his foot. His horse fell on some ice. I smiled. The owner of Thornfield Hall had returned. But I did not see Mr. Rochester again that day. I saw Mr. Rochester the next day. He sent for me in the evening. I put on a clean dress. I brushed my hair carefully. Mr. Rochester was in the large sitting room. He was sitting in a big chair. His right foot was on a small chair. Mr. S. Fairfax and Adele were sitting with him.
This is Miss Eyre, sir.
Mrs. Fairfax said. Mr. Rochester looked at me. He did not smile.
Sit by the fire, Miss Eyre.
He said.
Where have you come from?
From Lowood School.
I replied.
I was there for 8 years.
8 years.
Mr. Rochester said.
That is a long time. Who are your parents?
I have no parents, sir.
I answered.
They are dead.
But where is your home, Miss Eyre?
Mr. Rochester asked.
I have no home, sir. I have no family.
I said.
Why did you come to Thornfield Hall?
Mr. Rochester asked.
I wanted to leave Lowood, sir.
I replied.
I put an advertisement in a newspaper. Mrs. Fairfax replied to my advertisement. Yes, I did.
Mrs. Fairfax said.
Miss Eyre is a good teacher, Mr. Rochester.
Mr. Rochester smiled for the first time.
You are very young, Miss Eyre.
He said.
I am 18, sir.
I replied. Mr. Rochester smiled again. He did not ask me more questions. After that evening, I did not see Mr. Rochester for a few days. Then, one night, he sent for me again.
Sit near me, Miss Eyre.
He said.
Mrs. Fairfax will talk to Adele.
I sat down quietly, but I did not speak. The fire was very bright. One saw Mr. Rochester's face clearly. I saw his large, dark eyes. He was smiling. He was happy. After a minute, Mr. Rochester spoke.
Miss Eyre.
He said.
You are looking at me very carefully. Am I a handsome man?
No, sir.
I said.
You speak the truth, Miss Eyre.
Mr. Rochester said.
Look at me again. Am I a kind man?
No, sir.
I said again.
You are smiling now. But you are not always kind.
That is true.
Mr. Rochester replied.
I have had a difficult life. I have met bad people. I have been a bad person myself. Now, Thornfield Hall is my home. But I hate this house. You are very young, Miss Eyre. You cannot understand me.
You are right. I don't understand you, sir.
I said. I stood up.
Where are you going?
Mr. Rochester asked.
It is late. Adele must go to bed.
I said.
Are you frightened of me, Miss Eyre?
Mr. Rochester asked.
No, sir.
I replied.
But you say strange things, sir.
Mr. Rochester smiled.
Take Adele to her bedroom now, Miss Eyre.
He said.
We will talk again tomorrow.
After that night, we talked together many times. Mr. Rochester was an interesting man. But he was a strange man too. I often thought about him.
Why does Mr. Rochester hate Thornfield?
I asked myself.
Thornfield Hall is a beautiful place. But Mr. Rochester is not happy.
Chapter 5 Fire.
It was March. One night I was in bed. But I was not asleep. The house was quiet. Suddenly I heard a sound in the corridor outside my room. Who's there? I said. Nobody answered. Then I heard a strange laugh. I got out of my bed and I went quietly to the door. I listened. I heard another sound. Somebody was walking up the stairs to the top corridor. Then I heard somebody close a door.
Was that Grace Poole? I said to myself.
Yes, it was Grace.
Why was she laughing? And why is she walking in the house at night? Is she mad? I must tell Mrs. Fairfax about this. I will speak to her now. I put on some clothes and I opened the door. There was a candle on the floor outside my room. The candle was burning. There was thick smoke in the corridor. I went into the corridor. I looked around me. The door of Mr. Rochester's bedroom was open, and the smoke was coming from Mr. Rochester's room. I ran into the room. I sat in a chair by the window. Time passed. At last, Mr. Rochester returned.
Please don't worry, Jane.
He said.
Grace Poole is a strange woman, but she won't hurt anybody tonight.
I stood up.
Good night, sir,
I said. Mr. Rochester held my hand. He looked at me and he smiled.
Thank you, my dear friend.
He said.
You saved my life tonight, Jane.
Good night, sir,
I said again. I went back to my bed. I was very tired. But at first, I could not sleep. Suddenly, I understood something. I loved Mr. Rochester. He had smiled at me. He had held my hand. Did he love me? I did not know. But I thought about Mr. Rochester for a long time. I did not see Mr. Rochester the next day. He did not send for me. In the evening, I went down to Mrs. Fairfax's sitting room. The housekeeper was looking out of the window.
The weather has been good today,
Mrs. Fairfax said.
Mr. Rochester had a good day for his journey. His journey? Where has he gone?
I asked. I was surprised.
He has gone to Ingram Park,
Mrs. Fairfax replied.
Mr. Rochester will stay there for a week or more. He has many friends. All his friends will be at Ingram Park this week. Will there be any ladies at Ingram Park?
I asked.
Yes,
Mrs. Fairfax said.
there will be many ladies there. Miss Blanche Ingram will be there. Mr. Rochester has known her for many years. Is Miss Ingram beautiful?
I asked.
She is very beautiful,
Mrs. Fairfax said.
Will Mr. Rochester marry her?
I asked. Mrs. Fairfax smiled.
I don't know, Miss Eyre,
She replied.
I don't know.
I was very unhappy. I went up to my bedroom. I looked in my mirror.
Jane Eyre,
I said to myself.
you are not pretty, and you are poor. Mr. Rochester will never marry you. He will marry Miss Blanche Ingram. She is a rich lady, you are a poor governess. Forget Mr. Rochester, Jane Eyre, forget him.
Chapter 6 Guests at Thornfield Hall. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Mrs. Fairfax.
Mr. Rochester will return on Thursday,
Mrs. Fairfax said.
Some of his friends will come here with him. There will be many guests at Thornfield Hall.
On Thursday evening, Mrs. Fairfax, Adele and I were in Adele's bedroom. Mrs. Fairfax was looking out of the window.
The guests are arriving now,
Mrs. Fairfax said. I went to the window and I looked out. There were 3 carriages. 2 people were riding horses. Mr. Rochester was riding his big black horse. A beautiful young woman was riding a white horse. Mrs. Fairfax pointed to the young woman.
That is Miss Ingram,
The housekeeper said. Then she went downstairs. Adele wanted to go downstairs too.
No, Adele.
I said.
We cannot go downstairs tonight.
Mr. Rochester is talking to his guests. The next day, Mrs. Fairfax came into the schoolroom.
Mr. Rochester wants you to meet his guests tonight, Miss Eyre,
she said.
Adele must meet them too.
Later, Adele and I went quietly into the sitting room. And soon, 8 ladies came into the room. One of them was tall, dark, and very beautiful. She was Blanche Ingram. Adele ran towards her.
Good evening, beautiful lady,
she said in French.
What a pretty little girl,
Blanche Ingram said. Miss Ingram spoke to the other ladies. And she spoke to Adele. But she did not speak to me. Half an hour later, the gentleman came into the room. I looked at Mr. Rochester. He saw me, but he did not speak to me. Miss Ingram pointed at Adele.
Why doesn't this little girl live at a school, Mr. Rochester?
She asked.
Adele learns her lessons at home.
Mr. Rochester replied.
She has a governess.
Oh, yes. That small woman by the window.
Miss Ingram said.
I had many governesses. I hated all of them. They were all ugly and stupid.
Later, Miss Ingram and Mr. Rochester sang some songs together. Mr. Rochester had a fine voice. I listened to the songs, then I left the room. Mr. Rochester followed me.
What is wrong, Jane?
He asked.
Nothing is wrong, sir,
I said.
But I am tired. I am going to my room. Good night, sir.
You are tired. And you are unhappy too.
Mr. Rochester replied.
There are tears in your eyes. Rest now, Jane. But please come and meet my guests tomorrow evening. Don't forget, Jane.
The guests stayed at Thornfield Hall for 2 weeks. Every evening, I went to the sitting room with Adele. Nobody spoke to me. Mr. Rochester and Miss Ingram were always together. One afternoon, Mr. Rochester went to Millcote. He returned late in the evening. I met him at the front door.
Another guest has arrived, sir,
I told him.
His name is Mr. Mason. He has come from the West Indies.
Suddenly, Mr. Rochester's face was pale. He held my hand tightly.
Mason. The West Indies. Mason. He said.
Are you ill, sir? I asked.
Jane, my little friend, I've had a shock.
He said.
Bring me a glass of wine, please.
I went quickly to the dining room. I returned with a glass of wine and I gave it to Mr. Rochester.
What are my guests doing?
He asked.
They are eating and laughing, sir,
I replied.
Mr. Mason is talking to the other guests.
One day, they will all hate me.
Mr. Rochester said.
Now go into the dining room again. Tell Mason to meet me in the library.
I gave Mr. Mason the message. Then I went to my bedroom. I got into my bed. Later, I heard Mr. Rochester coming up the stairs with Mr. Mason. They were laughing and talking. Soon, I was asleep. Chapter 7, A Terrible Night. Some hours later, I woke up. A terrible cry had woken me. The moon was bright. Its light was shining through my window. I listened. Then I heard somebody shouting.
Help! Help! Rochester, help me!
The voice came from the top corridor.
Help! Help!
I got out of bed and I put on a dress and some shoes. I opened my door. All the guests were in the corridor outside the bedrooms. They were all asking questions.
What happened?
They asked.
Is there a fire? Who is hurt?
Where is Mr. Rochester?
I am here.
Mr. Rochester said. He was walking down the stairs from the top corridor.
What is wrong, Mr. Rochester?
Miss Ingram asked.
What has happened?
Nothing is wrong.
Mr. Rochester replied.
One of the servants has had a bad dream. Go back to bed.
I went back to my room, but something was wrong. I did not get into my bed. I waited. Soon, somebody knocked on my door. I opened the door. Mr. Rochester was standing in the corridor.
Jane, follow me. Do not make a sound.
Mr. Rochester said. We went up to the top corridor. Mr. Rochester unlocked a door and we went inside a room. Mr. Mason was sitting on a chair in the room. His face was pale, and his shirt was covered with blood. Then I heard a terrible laugh. The sound came from the next room.
Grace Poole is a madwoman,
I thought.
Why does Mr. Rochester have a mad servant?
Mr. Rochester spoke quietly to Mr. Mason.
I am going to bring a doctor, Richard.
He said. Then he spoke to me.
Stay here, Jane. Wash Mr. Mason's arm, but do not speak to him.
Mr. Rochester left the room. I washed Mr. Mason's arm. We waited for Mr. Rochester and the doctor. Mr. Mason did not speak to me and I did not speak to him. After 2 hours, Mr. Rochester returned. The doctor was with him. The doctor looked at Mr. Mason's arm.
She bit me.
Mr. Mason said.
I came up here. I wanted to see her. I wanted to help her. But she bit me.
Be quiet now. Richard.
Mr. Rochester said quickly. The doctor put a bandage on Mr. Mason's arm. Mr. Rochester put Mr. Mason's coat round the injured man's shoulders. Then he spoke to me again.
Run downstairs, Jane. Unlock the small door at the side of the houses.
He said.
We will follow you.
I went quickly downstairs and I opened the door. Outside the door, a servant was waiting with a carriage. Mr. Mason and the doctor came out of the house. They got into the carriage. Then Mr. Rochester came out of the house too. Mr. Mason spoke to him through the window of the carriage.
Help her. Be kind to her, Rochester.
He said.
Yes, I will, Mason.
Mr. Rochester said. The servant drove the carriage away.
Will you walk in the garden with me, Jane?
Mr. Rochester asked.
I do not want to sleep now.
Yes, I will, sir.
I said. Soon, it was morning. The birds were beginning to sing. The flowers had a sweet smell.
It has been a strange night, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
Were you frightened?
I am frightened of Grace Poole.
I said.
She will hurt you, one day.
I am stronger than she is. She will not hurt me.
Mr. Rochester said. He looked at me for a few moments.
Are you my friend, Jane?
He asked me.
Yes, sir, I will be your friend forever.
I replied.
Thank you, Mother.
Mr. Rochester said.
I have made mistakes. Now, I want to be happy. That is not wrong, is it, Jane?
He stopped speaking for a minute. Then he said.
Go into the house. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
But the next day, I had a letter from Gateshead Hall, my Aunt Reed's house. The letter was from my cousin Eliza. I started the journey to my Aunt Reed's house immediately. I arrived there the next day. My Aunt Reed was very, very ill. She could not move. And she did not speak to me. I wanted to return to Thornfield Hall. I wanted to see Mr. Rochester, but Eliza wanted me to stay at Gateshead Hall. After 3 weeks, my aunt spoke to me at last. She spoke very slowly.
Are you Jane Eyre?
She asked.
Yes, Aunt Reed. I'm Jane Eyre.
I replied.
There is a letter for you.
Aunt Reed said.
It is in my desk. Call Eliza, please. She will get the letter.
Eliza came into the room. She opened the desk and she gave me a letter.
Read the letter, Jane.
My aunt said. The letter had come from Madeira, but it was 3 years old.
I answered that letter.
Aunt Reed said.
I hated you, Jane. I did not want you to have your uncle's money. I wrote to John Eyre. I wrote Jane Eyre is dead. She died at Lowood School. I am sorry, Jane. I was wrong.
Mrs. Reed died that night. I left Gateshead Hall a few days later. I took my uncle's letter with me. Mr. Rochester met me at Thornfield Hall.
Welcome back to my house.
He said.
This is your home, Jane.
Thank you, sir.
I said.
I am very happy here.
Mr. Rochester's guests had left. No other visitors came to Thornfield Hall. Every day, Mr. Rochester and I talked together. And every day, I loved him more. Chapter 8 in the Garden. In June, the weather was hot. One evening, I walked into the garden. Mr. Rochester was there too.
Do you like this house, Jane?
He asked.
Yes, sir.
I replied.
Soon, Adele will go to live at a school, Jane.
He said.
Then, I will not want a governess here. Will you be sad then, Jane? Will you leave Thornfield Hall?
Leave.
I said quickly.
Must I leave Thornfield?
My dear.
Mr. Rochester stopped. He was silent for a moment. Then he said,
I am going to be married soon.
Oh, sir.
I said.
Then I must go far away. Far away from Thornfield. Far away from you, sir.
I started to cry.
I will always remember you, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
Will you forget me?
No, sir.
I replied.
I will never forget you. I don't want to leave Thornfield, sir. I don't want to leave you.
Don't leave, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
Stay here.
He smiled at me.
I am poor. I do not have a pretty face. But I have a heart. It is a loving heart, sir.
Jane, I'm not going to marry Miss Ingram.
Mr. Rochester said.
She is rich. She is beautiful. You are poor. You are not beautiful. But I want to marry you. Will you marry me, Jane?
For a moment, I could not speak. At last, I asked.
Do you love me, sir?
I do.
He replied.
Then, sir, I will marry you.
I said. And Mr. Rochester kissed me.
My dearest Jane.
He said.
Nothing can stop our marriage now. We will be married in a month, Jane.
We kissed again. Then I said good night and I went into the house. I went upstairs to my room. Later, I remembered my Uncle John Eyre's letter.
I will write to him in Madeira.
I said to myself.
I will tell him about my marriage to Mr. Rochester. I am very happy. My uncle will be happy too.
4 weeks passed. Mr. Rochester was going to buy me many beautiful things. He was going to give me many presents. But I did not want these things.
No, Edward.
I said.
I'm not beautiful. I don't want beautiful things. I want you, Edward.
It was the month of July. 2 days before our wedding day, Mr. Rochester went away.
I will return tomorrow.
He said.
I love you, Jane.
That night, I went to my bedroom early. My wedding dress and my wedding veil were in my room. I looked at them.
In 2 days, I will be Jane Rochester,
I said to myself. Then I went to bed. But I did not sleep well. The next day, Mr. Rochester returned. He looked at me carefully.
What is wrong, Jane?
He asked.
Your face is pale. Are you frightened?
I had a very strange dream last night.
I said.
It was a dream about this house. But in my dream, Thornfield Hall had no roof. The walls were burnt. They were black. In my dream, I tried to find you. But you were not in the house.
Are you afraid of a dream, Jane?
Mr. Rochester asked.
No, Edward,
I replied.
but I woke up from my dream. There was a woman in my room. She was tall and heavy. She had long black hair. The woman was holding a candle.
I said.
She put the candle by my mirror. She put my wedding veil over her head and she looked in the mirror. Then I saw her face. It was a strange, terrible face, Edward. Suddenly, the woman tore my veil into 2 pieces. She threw the pieces on the floor.
What happened next?
The woman held her candle near my face. She looked at me and she laughed. Then she went away.
This happened in your dream, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
It did not happen in my dream, Edward.
I said.
This morning, my wedding veil was on the floor of my room. It was torn. It was in 2 pieces.
But the woman did not hurt you, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
Sleep in Adele's room tonight, my dear. You will have no more bad dreams.
Chapter 9, Mr. Rochester's Wife. It was our wedding day. We were going to be married in a church near Thornfield Hall. After the marriage, we were going to travel to London. I got up early. I put on my wedding dress and I went downstairs. Mr. Rochester was waiting for me. At 8 o'clock, we walked together to the church. The clergyman was standing by the door of the church. There were 2 other people inside the church, 2 men. They were sitting in a dark corner. I could not see them very well. The clergyman started to speak. At every marriage, the clergyman asks an important question. He asks the people in the church,
Is there a problem about this marriage?
The clergyman spoke loudly. He asked this question and he waited. There was silence for a moment. And then one of the men in the dark corner stood up. He spoke loudly.
There is a problem. These 2 people must not be married.
He said.
There is not a problem.
Mr. Rochester said to the clergyman.
Please go on with the marriage.
No, I cannot go on with the marriage.
The clergyman replied. He spoke to the man in the corner.
What is the problem, sir?
He asked. Mr. Rochester turned and looked at the man.
Who are you? What do you know about me?
He asked angrily.
My name is Briggs, sir. I am a lawyer.
The man replied.
I know many things about you. 15 years ago, you were married in the West Indies. Your wife's name is Bertha Mason. She is alive. She lives at Thornfield Hall.
How do you know that?
Mr. Rochester shouted. The other man in the dark corner stood up. He walked towards us. It was Richard Mason.
Bertha Mason is my sister.
He said.
I saw her at Thornfield Hall in April.
Mr. Rochester's face was pale. For a minute he was silent. Then he spoke quietly.
It is true.
He said.
My wife is living at Thornfield Hall. She is mad. Come to the house, all of you. Come and see Mrs. Rochester. Come and see the madwoman.
We all left the church. Nobody spoke. At Thornfield, Mrs. Fairfax and Adele were waiting for us. They were smiling happily.
Nobody will be happy today.
Mr. Rochester said.
We are not married.
Briggs, Mr. Mason, the clergyman, and I followed Mr. Rochester. We followed him up the stairs. He took us to the top corridor. He unlocked a door and we went into a small room. I had seen this room before. We walked through the room to another door. Mr. Rochester unlocked this door and we saw a larger room. Grace Poole was sitting in the room. But another woman was there too. She was tall and heavy. Her dark hair was in front of her face. The woman turned and looked at us. I knew that terrible, mad face. I had seen it in my bedroom 2 nights before. The madwoman saw Mr. Rochester. She screamed and she ran towards him. The madwoman was very strong. She screamed and she hit Mr. Rochester. But Mr. Rochester held her arms.
This woman is my wife.
Mr. Rochester said angrily.
I wanted to forget about her. I wanted to marry this young girl, Jane Eyre. Was I wrong?
He was silent for a few moments. Then he spoke quietly.
Yes. I was wrong.
He said.
I love Jane Eyre. But I was wrong. Now go, all of you. I must take care of my mad wife.
I went slowly downstairs. Mr. Briggs, the lawyer, spoke to me.
I am sorry for you, Miss Eyre.
He said.
You did nothing wrong. Your uncle, John Eyre, is sorry for you too. He read your letter. And then he met Richard Mason in Madeira. Your uncle is dying, Miss Eyre. He could not come to England. He sent me here. He wanted me to stop this marriage.
I did not answer. I went to my room and I locked the door. I took off my wedding dress. I put on a plain black dress. I lay down on my bed.
I am Jane Eyre today.
I thought.
I will be Jane Eyre tomorrow. I will never be Jane Rochester. I must leave Thornfield Hall. I must never see Mr. Rochester again. My life here is finished.
Many hours later, I got off the bed. I unlocked my door. Mr. Rochester was waiting outside my room.
You are unhappy, Jane.
He said.
I am very, very sorry. Jane, we will leave Thornfield. We will go to another country. We will be happy again.
I cannot be your wife. I cannot live with you,
I said.
I must leave you, Edward.
Listen, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
My father wanted me to marry Bertha Mason. Her family was very rich. I married her. My father was happy. But I was not happy. Bertha was mad, and she was a bad woman. Nobody told me about her. She was married to me, but she met other men. She was drunk every day. She tried to kill me many times. After 4 years, I brought Bertha here to Thornfield Hall.
Mr. Rochester said.
Then I went away. Grace Poole took care of Bertha. I met other women. One of them was a French singer. She was Adele's mother. Adele is my daughter, Jane. But I did not love the French singer. I did not love anybody. I came home to Thornfield Hall. Then you came here and I loved you. I will always love you. Please stay with me, Jane.
No, Edward.
I said.
I'm going away. We will be unhappy. But we must not be together. Goodbye, Edward.
Oh, Jane. Jane, my love,
Mr. Rochester said.
don't leave me.
I kissed Mr. Rochester.
God will help you, Edward.
I said. Quickly, I went into my room. I put some clothes into a bag. Later, I heard Mr. Rochester go into his room. Very quietly, I went downstairs. I opened the small door at the side of the house. I left Thornfield Hall and one walked to the road. It was dark. Soon, a coach came along the road. I gave all my money to the driver of the coach. I got into the coach. Many hours later, the coach stopped. It was 10 o'clock in the morning.
You must give me more money now.
The driver said.
I have no more money.
I said.
You have no more money? Then you must get out of the coach.
The driver said. I got down onto the road. The coach moved away quickly. But I had left my bag in the coach. I looked around me. I was on a cold, empty moor. I was tired and hungry. I walked and walked. I had no money. I had no food. I walked until the evening came. At last, I lay down on the ground. I fell asleep immediately. Chapter 10, Morehouse. The next morning, I woke late. I walked along the road for many miles. It started to rain. Soon my clothes were wet. I saw no one. I walked on the moor all day. In the evening, I was very tired again.
I must sleep soon.
I thought.
Where shall I sleep?
Then I saw a light. I walked slowly towards it. The rain was falling heavily. But I saw a house near the road. I walked up to the house. I knocked on the door. I waited, but nobody opened the door. I stood outside the house. I was very cold and very tired. I could not move.
I'm going to die here,
I said. Then I heard a young man's voice. The man was standing behind me.
No, you will not die at Morehouses.
The man said. Then he unlocked the door of the house. He took me into the house. He took me into a warm sitting room.
Please sit down,
He said. Two pretty young women came into the room.
Give this poor woman some food, Diana.
The young man said.
Give her some dry clothes, Mary.
Then he spoke to me again.
My name is St. John Rivers.
He said.
These are my sisters, Diana and Mary. What is your name, young woman?
My name is Jane Elliot.
I said. I closed my eyes.
Jane is very tired.
Diana said.
She must go to bed now.
I stayed in bed at Morehouse for 3 days. Diana and Mary Rivers were governesses. They were staying at Morehouse for a few days. St. John, their brother, was a clergyman. They were very kind to me. Soon, we were good friends. One day, St. John asked me about my life.
I was a governess too,
I told him. And I told him about Lowood School. But I did not tell him about Thornfield Hall. I did not tell him about Mr. Rochester.
I want to work, St. John,
I said.
Will you help me? I have a plan.
St. John said.
A few miles from here, there is a village. Many of the girls in the village cannot read or write. I am going to pay for a girls' school in the village. But I must find a teacher for these girls.
I will teach them, St. John,
I said.
Good.
He said.
There will be a small house next to the school. You will live there.
3 days later, a letter arrived for St. John.
Diana, Mary, or Uncle John is dead.
He told his sisters.
But we will not have any of his money.
He gave the letter to his sisters. They read it.
Uncle John was our mother's brother.
Diana told me.
He was very rich. But he has given all his money to another niece. We do not know her.
Soon, I went to live in the village. I lived in the house next to the school. Every day, I taught the girls. My pupils worked hard. But I was not happy. Every day, I thought about Edward Rochester.
Does he think about me?
I asked myself. 4 months passed. One day, St. John Rivers came to my house. He was holding a letter. He was worried.
What is wrong?
I asked.
I want to ask you 3 questions, Jane.
He replied.
Is your name Jane Elliot? Do you have another name? Do you know Jane Eyre?
I looked at him for a moment. I did not speak.
I have some news for Jane Eyre.
St. John said.
Jane Eyre was a pupil at Lowood School. And she was a teacher there. Then she was a governess at Thornfield Hall, the home of Mr. Edward Rochester.
How do you know this?
I asked.
What do you know about Mr. Rochester? How is he?
I don't know.
St. John said.
This letter is from a lawyer. The lawyer tells a story about Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester had a mad wife. But he tried to marry Jane Eyre. She left Thornfield. Now, this lawyer, Mr. Briggs, is trying to find her.
I will tell you the truth, St. John.
I said.
My name is not Jane Elliot. My name is Jane Eyre. And I was a governess at Thornfield Hall. I know Mr. Rochester. Did Mr. Briggs write anything about Mr. Rochester?
No, the letter is about you, Jane.
St. John said.
Your Uncle John Eyre is dead. John Eyre has given you £20,000. You are rich, Jane.
But why did Mr. Briggs write to you?
I asked.
My mother's name was Eyre.
St. John said.
She was your father's sister, Jane.
Then you, Diana, and Mary are my cousins.
I said. I thought carefully for a moment.
Write to Diana and Mary.
I said.
They must come home. I will give all of you some of Uncle John's money.
The next day, I wrote to Mr. Briggs. I gave St. John, Diana, and Mary £5,000 each. I wrote to Mrs. Fairfax too, but she did not reply. 6 months passed. I heard nothing from Thornfield Hall. I heard nothing about Mr. Rochester. Then, one day, I was walking on the moor. Suddenly, I heard a voice. There was nobody on the moor. But the voice was calling my name.
Jane, Jane, Jane.
That is Mr. Rochester's voice.
I said to myself. Then I shouted.
I am coming, Edward. I am coming.
I ran to Moor House. I spoke to my cousins.
I am going to Thornfield Hall tomorrow.
I told them. I began my journey the next day. Chapter 11. My story ends. 2 days later, I got out of a coach. I was standing on the road near Thornfield Hall. I ran across the fields. Was Mr. Rochester at Thornfield? Was he ill? And then I saw the house. The house had no roof. Its walls were burnt and black. Nobody was living there. I looked at the burnt black house. I had seen this before. I had seen it in a dream. I was frightened. Where was Edward Rochester? I went to the village of Eyre. I asked about Thornfield Hall. I asked about Mr. Rochester.
3 months ago, there was a fire at Thornfield Hall.
A man told me.
The madwoman burned the house. She was Mr. Rochester's wife.
Was Mr. Rochester in the house?
I asked.
Yes, he was there.
The man replied.
He tried to save his wife's life. He went into the burning house. But the madwoman jumped from the roof. She died.
Was Mr. Rochester hurt?
I asked quickly.
Yes, he was badly hurt.
The man said.
He is blind, he can't see. And he has only one hand.
Where is he? I asked.
Where is he?
He is living at Ferndean. It is an old house, about 30 miles away.
The man said.
Do you have a carriage?
I asked.
I must go to Ferndean immediately.
I got out of the carriage near Ferndean. I walked to the house. I knocked on the door. A servant opened it. I knew her.
Oh, Miss Eyre. You have come,
she said.
Mr. Rochester has been calling your name.
A bell rang in another room.
That is Mr. Rochester's bell,
the woman said.
He wants some candles.
There were 2 candles on a table near the door. The woman lit them and she picked them up.
Mr. Rochester is blind, but he always burns candles in his room in the evenings,
she said.
Give the candles to me,
I said.
I'll take them to him.
I opened the door of Mr. Rochester's room. His black and white dog was sitting by the fire. The dog jumped up and ran towards me.
Who is there?
Mr. Rochester said.
Don't you know me, Edward?
I asked.
Your dog knows me.
I put the candles on a table. I held Mr. Rochester's hand.
I know that voice. And I know this little hand.
Mr. Rochester said.
Is that you, Jane?
Yes, sir, I have found you at last,
I said.
I will never leave you again.
Then I told Mr. Rochester my story.
Why did you leave your cousins, Jane?
Mr. Rochester asked.
Why did you come back to me? I am blind. I have only one hand.
I will take care of you, Edward,
I said.
But I don't want a servant.
Mr. Rochester replied.
I want a wife.
You will have a wife, Edward,
I said.
I will be your wife. I will marry you. I loved you very much at Thornfield Hall. Now I love you more.
Mr. Rochester and I got married. After a time, his eyes were better. He could see a little. He saw the face of our first child. My dear Edward and I are very happy.
Lost love. These things happened to me nearly 10 years ago. I lived in a city, but the city was hot in summer. I wanted to see the country. I wanted to walk in the woods and see green trees. I had a little red car and I had a map too. I drove all night out into the country. I was happy in my car. We had a very good summer that year. The country was very pretty in the early morning. The sun was hot, and the sky was blue. I heard the birds in the trees. And then my car stopped suddenly.
What's wrong?
I thought.
Oh dear, I haven't got any petrol. Now I'll have to walk. I'll have to find a town and buy some petrol. But where am I?
I looked at the map. I wasn't near a town. I was lost in the country. And then I saw the girl. She walked down the road, with flowers in her hand. She wore a long dress, and her hair was long too. It was long and black, and it shone in the sun. She was very pretty. I wanted to speak to her, so I got out of the car.
Hello.
I said.
I'm lost. Where am I?
She looked afraid, so I spoke quietly.
I haven't got any petrol.
I said.
Where can I find some?
Her blue eyes looked at me, and she smiled.
She's a very pretty girl.
I thought.
I do not know. Come with me to the village. Perhaps we can help you.
I went with her happily, and we walked a long way.
There isn't a village on the map.
I thought.
Perhaps it's a very small village.
There was a village, and it was old and pretty. The houses were black and white and very small. There were a lot of animals. The girl stopped at a house and smiled at me.
Come in, please.
She said. I went in. The house was very clean, but it was strange too. There was a fire and some food above it. I felt hungry then.
That's strange.
I thought.
They cook their food over a wood fire. Perhaps they have no money.
I met her father and mother, and I liked them. They were nice people, but their clothes were strange.
Sit down,
said the old man.
Are you thirsty after your walk?
He gave me a drink, and I said,
Thank you.
But the drink was strange too. It was dark brown and very strong. I didn't understand. But I was happy there. I asked about petrol, but the old man didn't understand.
Petrol,
he asked.
What is that? This is strange.
I thought. Then I asked.
Do you walk everywhere?
The old man smiled.
Oh, no, we use horses,
he said.
Horses.
I thought.
Horses are very slow. Why don't they have cars?
But I didn't say that to the old man. I felt happy there. I stayed all day, and I ate dinner with them that evening. Then the girl and I went out into the garden. The girl's name was Mary.
This is nice.
She said.
We like having visitors. We do not see many people here.
We spoke happily. She was very beautiful, but after a time, she began to talk quietly, and her face was sad.
Why are you sad?
I asked her.
I cannot tell you.
She said.
You are only a visitor here. We have to say goodbye tonight. You have to go now.
I didn't understand. I loved her. I knew that. And I wanted to help her. Why did I have to go? But Mary said again in a sad voice.
You have to go. It is dangerous here.
So I said.
I'll go to the next town and find some petrol. Then I'll come back.
She didn't speak.
I love you, Mary.
I said.
And I'll come back to you. You won't stop me.
She said goodbye to me at the door. Her face was very sad, and I was sad too. I didn't want to go. It was midnight. The night was very dark, but I walked and walked. I was very tired when I saw the lights of a town. I found some petrol, and then I asked the name of the village. But the man at the garage gave me a strange look.
What village?
He asked. I told him about the village. I told him about the old houses and the people with strange clothes. Again he gave me a strange look. He thought, and then he said,
There was a village there, but it isn't there now. There are stories about it, strange stories.
What do people say about it?
I asked. He didn't want to tell me, But then he said,
There was a big fire in the village. Everybody died. There aren't any people or houses there now.
How did it happen?
I asked.
And why?
Oliver Cromwell killed them.
He said.
He was angry with the villagers because they helped the king in the war.
I couldn't speak.
This isn't right.
I thought.
That war happened 350 years ago.
Then I remembered the strange clothes, the long hair, the food over the fire, and the old houses. And I remembered, too, about the horses.
But I don't understand.
I cried.
I saw the people in the village. I spoke to some people there.
The man looked quickly at me, and then he spoke.
There's an interesting story about the village. For one day every 10 years, it lives again, but only for one day. Then it goes away again for another 10 years. On that one day, you can find the village. But you have to leave before morning, or you will never leave.
Can this be right?
I thought. Perhaps it was. Mary said.
You have to go.
She loved me, but she said.
We have to say goodbye.
She was afraid for me.
Now I understand.
I thought. I went back to the village, but it wasn't there. I looked again and again, but I couldn't find it. I saw only flowers and trees. I heard only the sound of the birds and the wind. I was very sad. I sat down on the ground and cried. I will never forget that day. I remember Mary, and I will always love her. Now, I only have to wait 2 months. The village will connect back again. On the right day, I will go back. I will find her again, my love with the long, black hair. And this time, I will not leave before morning. I will stay with her. Soon, everyone is talking about the story. People do not like Emma now. Sophia is right. Emma is selfish. #selfish Emma. Emma wants to win on her own. Bad idea. Sophia is a better singer than Emma. #Sophia better. Sophia is going to win, with or without Emma. Sophia speaks to the reporter.
That story isn't true.
She says.
Emma isn't selfish.
But now lots of people are talking about you and Emma.
He says.
Selfish Emma is the biggest story of Sing to Win. And it's good for you.
But it's wrong.
Sophia says.
It doesn't matter.
The reporter says.
It's because of the story.
Laura says.
What story?
Sophia asks.
About you and Emma. Look.
Selfish Emma wants to sing on her own.
Says Sophia. Sophia wants to sing with Emma, but Emma says.
No. I'm better than Sophia. Oh no.
Says Sophia.
It isn't true. Why?
Perhaps the reporter wants a good story.
Says Laura. Sophia phones Emma, but Emma does not answer. Chapter 3, Selfish Emma. There is 1 month before the first round of Sing to Win. Sophia and Emma are doing things every day. They learn new songs and speak to reporters. But they text a lot and meet at the weekends. Lots of people like them. They want to see Sophia and Emma in the final. One afternoon, Sophia is talking to some reporters.
Why is your hair blue?
Asks one reporter.
Which singers do you like?
Asks a second. Then the reporter from the audition says,
Are you going to sing with Emma in the first round?
No, I'm going to sing on my own.
But people want you to sing together.
Says the reporter.
Well, Emma doesn't want to.
Says Sophia.
But I'm okay with that.
The next morning, Sophia texts Emma.
Hi. How are you?
She texts her again after breakfast.
Are we meeting today?
Emma does not answer, so Sophia texts her again in the afternoon.
You're quiet today. Nervous?
Then Emma answers.
Don't text me again.
Just then, Sophia's sister arrives home.
Are you okay?
Asks Laura.
No.
Says Sophia, and she tells her sister about the texts.
I'm sorry.
Says Emma.
It doesn't matter. Hey, are you going to have a sandwich?
Asks Sophia.
Yes, good idea.
Says Emma, and they look at the menu. Just then, Sophia and Emma hear a new song in the cafe. They look up.
Oh, I love this song.
Says Emma.
I love it, too.
Sophia laughs. Chapter 2, Friends. That night, Sophia gets a text from Emma.
Are you going to be in Sing to Win? Emma X.
Yes, you? Wow. Me too. Amazing. Want to meet on Saturday? 1 p.m.? Do you know the Happy Cafe?
Yes, see you there.
It is Saturday at the cafe. Sophia and Emma are talking about Sing to Win.
Our auditions are online now and people love us.
Emma says.
I know. It's amazing.
Sophia says.
You have 23,429 likes.
Yes. And you have 21,632. Oh, and look at this, people want us to sing together. I like that idea. What do you think?
Asks Sophia. Emma is quiet, and she looks away.
I don't know, Sophia. I'd like to sing on my own. I get very nervous when I sing with people.
That's okay. It's only an idea. Here's my number.
Says Sophia.
Text me after your audition.
Okay.
Emma says.
And good luck.
Thanks. You too.
Emma smiles. Now it is Sophia's audition. The judges are watching her, and everyone is very quiet. Suddenly, she feels nervous.
This is it,
she thinks. She sings well, and 2 of the judges say. Yes, but she needs yes from all 3 judges, or she cannot be in Sing to Win. Sophia waits nervously. After a long minute, the 3rd judge says, okay, yes.
Wow.
Says Sophia happily, and claps her hands. Chapter 1, The Audition.
It's your big day tomorrow, Sophia.
Says Laura to her younger sister.
I know. I can't wait. My audition for Sing to Win.
Says Sophia.
You're an amazing singer.
Says Laura.
The judges are going to love you. Then you can be on TV, in front of millions of people.
Sophia laughs.
Thanks, Laura. You only say that because you're my big sister.
The next day, Sophia is waiting for her audition. In front of her, there is a girl with pink hair.
Hey.
Sophia says.
I love your hair.
Thanks, I like yours too.
Says the girl. Just then, a reporter arrives.
How are you feeling, girls?
Excited.
They say together. Then they laugh.
Are you sisters?
The reporter asks.
Yar no.
Says Sophia.
Friends.
Well, yes, we're now.
Says the girl.
I'm Emma.
She says to Sophia. Soon, it is Emma's audition. But she is good, and the audience and the judges like her. They love Emma too. They are both in the final, and better than that, they are friends again. It is the big final. Sophia and Emma sing song after song after song. Sometimes Sophia is better, and sometimes Emma is better. But they are both amazing. Millions of people are watching them, in the audience and on TV. They stand on the stage together. Who is the winner? Sophia feels very nervous. They wait for the judges, but the judges talk and talk. Some people are shouting, Sophia. Some are shouting, Emma. There is a lot of noise. Suddenly, the judges call the winner's name.
Emma.
Sophia smiles. She is second, but she is happy for her friend. A judge says to Emma and Sophia,
Are you going to sing together now?
Yes. Yes. Sing together.
The audience shout. Emma looks at Sophia.
Let's do it.
She says.
Really?
Says Sophia.
Ease.
Says Emma. She takes Sophia's hand, and they sing, Friends Together. Chapter 5, The Final. 2 days later, Sophia gets a text from Emma.
Can we meet at the Happy Cafe? Tomorrow at 11:30? Emma X.
The next day, Sophia arrives at the Happy Cafe at 11:30. Emma is sitting at a table near the window.
Hi.
Says Sophia.
Hi.
Says Emma.
Listen, Sophia, the story isn't true. I can see that now. Reporters want a new story every day. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you, Emma. I need to listen to my friends, not reporters. They only want a good story. You're right.
Says Sophia. There are 7 more rounds of Sing to Win. Every week, one singer goes home, and every week Sophia thinks.
Is it me?
Then, the judges stand up and say,
Goodbye. Harry.
Sophia and Emma are in the second round. Sophia finds Emma when they come off the stage.
Oh, Emma? You're an amazing singer?
Thanks.
Says Emma quietly.
Emma, I'm sorry. The story isn't true. You're not selfish. Can we forget about it?
Sophia asks. This time, Emma does not answer. She looks down. Sophia runs away. She is crying, and she does not want Emma to see. The next day, all the stories are about Emma. Sophia and Laura read them together. Amazing Emma. Everyone loves Emma. Emma can sing to win.
I'm sorry, Sophia, nobody is talking about you now.
Says Laura.
It's okay. I'm happy for Emma, and I'm in the second round too. But I want to be friends again.
She says.
Give it some time.
Says Laura.
Then talk to her again.
Chapter 4, The First Round. It is the first round of Sing to Win, but Sophia is not very excited.
I'm going to see Emma today at Sing to Win.
She says to Laura.
She isn't speaking to me, and I feel bad about the story.
Listen, Sophia, forget it. The reporter is wrong, not you.
Says Laura.
I know, but...
No. Buts. You need to be excited again. Do you love singing?
Well, yes.
Then sing. Sing to win.
Now Sophia is on the stage. She wants to sing well, but she is very nervous. Millions of people are watching her. The judges watch and listen carefully. She is good. The judges like her, and the audience like her too.
Sophia? Sophia?
Sophia?
They shout. Now Sophia feels better. But next, it is Emma. The audience do not like Emma.
Boo!
They shout. Emma waits. She looks at her feet and her face is red. Sophia feels sorry for her.
Oh no.
She thinks.
Shh!
Say the judges.
Be quiet, everyone.
Then Emma sings. Her voice is beautiful. She is amazing. The audience are quiet now, very quiet. When Emma finishes, they all clap and stand up. The judges are standing up too. Emma smiles. Then all the singers are on the stage together. What are the judges going to say? Everyone is waiting for them. The singers all want to be in the second round, but one person must go home. The audience clap and shout.
The girl with green eyes.
Of Kersey.
The man in the brown hat said.
There are good policemen and there are bad policemen, you know.
You're right.
The young man said.
Yes. That's very true. Isn't it, Julie?
He looked at the young woman next to him. Julie didn't answer and looked bored. She closed her eyes.
Julie's my wife.
The young man told the man in the brown hat.
She doesn't like trains. She always feels ill on trains.
Oh yes.
The man in the brown hat said.
Now my wife, she doesn't like buses. She nearly had an accident on a bus once. It was last year. No, it wasn't. It was 2 years ago. I remember now. It was in Manchester.
He told a long, boring story about his wife and a bus in Manchester. It was a hot day, and the train was slow. There were 7 people in the carriage. There was the man in the brown hat, the young man and his wife, Julie, a mother and 2 children, and a tall dark man in an expensive suit. The young man's name was Bill. He had short brown hair and a happy smile. His wife, Julie, had long red hair and very green eyes the color of seawater. They were very beautiful eyes. The man in the brown hat talked and talked. He had a big red face and a loud voice. He talked to Bill because Bill liked to talk too. The man in the brown hat laughed a lot, and when he laughed, Bill laughed too. Bill liked talking and laughing with people. The 2 children were hot and bored. They didn't want to sit down. They wanted to be noisy and run up and down the train.
Now sit down and be quiet.
Their mother said. She was a small woman with a tired face and a tired voice.
I don't want to sit down.
The little boy said.
I'm thirsty.
Here. Have an orange.
His mother said. She took an orange out of her bag and gave it to him.
I want an orange too.
The little girl said loudly.
All right, here you, Eyre,
said her mother.
Eat it nicely now.
The children ate their oranges and were quiet for a minute. Then the little boy said,
I want a drink. I'm thirsty.
The tall, dark man took out his newspaper and began to read. Julie opened her eyes and looked at the back page of his newspaper. She read about the weather in Budapest and about the football in Liverpool. She wasn't interested in Budapest and she didn't like football, but she didn't want to listen to Bill and the man in the brown hat.
Talk, talk, talk.
She thought.
Bill never stops talking.
Then suddenly she saw the tall man's eyes over the top of his newspaper. She could not see his mouth, but there was a smile in his eyes. Quickly, she looked down at the newspaper and read about the weather in Budapest again. The train stopped at Dawlish station and people got on and got off. There was a lot of noise.
Is this our station?
The little girl asked. She went to the window and looked out.
No, it isn't. Now sit down.
Her mother said.
We're going to Penzance.
The little girl told Bill.
For our holidays. Eyre.
Her mother said.
My sister's got a little hotel by the sea. We're staying there. It's cheap, you see.
Eyre.
The man in the brown hat said.
It's a nice town. I know a man there. He's got a restaurant in King Street. A lot of holiday people go there. He makes a lot of money in the summer.
He laughed loudly.
Eyre.
He said again.
You can have a nice holiday in Penzance.
We're going to St. Austell.
Bill said.
Me and Julie. It's our first holiday. Julie wanted to go to Spain, but I like St. Austell. I always go there for my holidays. It's nice in August. You can have a good time there too.
Julie looked out of the window.
Where is Budapest?
She thought.
I want to go there. I want to go to Vienna, to Paris, to Rome, to Athens.
Her green eyes were bored and angry. Through the window she watched the little villages and hills of England. The man in the brown hat looked at Julie.
You're right.
He said to Bill.
You can have a good time on holiday in England. We always go to Brighton, me and the wife. But the weather. We went one year, and it rained every day. Morning, afternoon, and night. It's true. It never stopped raining.
He laughed loudly.
We nearly went home after the first week.
Bill laughed too.
What did you do all day, then?
He asked. Julie read about the weather in Budapest for the third time. Then she looked at the tall man's hands. They were long brown hands, very clean.
Nice hands.
She thought. He wore a very expensive Japanese watch.
Japan?
She thought.
I'd like to go to Japan.
She looked up and saw the man's eyes again over the top of his newspaper. This time she did not look away. Green eyes looked into dark brown eyes for a long, slow minute. After Newton Abbot station, the guard came into the carriage to look at their tickets.
Now then,
he said.
Where are we all going? This train's latey.
The man in the brown hat said.
20 minutes late, by my watch.
Julie opened her eyes and looked at the hack page of the tall dark man's newspaper.
10 minutes.
The guard said.
That's all.
He smiled at Julie. The tall dark man put his newspaper down, found his ticket, and gave it to the guard. The guard looked at it.
You're all right, sir?
He said.
The boat doesn't leave Plymouth before 6 o'clock. You've got lots of time.
The tall man smiled, put his ticket back in his pocket, and opened his newspaper again. Julie didn't look at him.
A boat.
She thought.
He's taking a boat from Plymouth. Where is he going?
She looked at him again with her long green eyes. He read his newspaper and didn't look at her. But his eyes smiled. The train stopped at Todd's station and more people got on and off.
Everybody's going on holiday.
Bill said. He laughed.
It's going to be wonderful. No work for 2 weeks. It's a nice, quiet town, St. Austell. We can stay in bed in the mornings and sit and talk in the afternoons and have a drink or two in the evenings. Julie?
He looked at his wife.
Are you all right, Julie?
Yes, Bill.
She said quietly.
I'm okay.
She looked out of the window again. The train went more quickly now, and it began to rain. Bill and the man in the brown hat talked and talked. Bill told a long story about 2 men and a dog, and the man in the brown hat laughed very loudly. Green eyes looked into dark brown eyes for a long, slow minute.
That's a good story.
He said.
I like that. You tell it very well. Do you know the story about?
And he told Bill a story about a Frenchman and a bicycle.
Why do people laugh at these stories?
Julie thought.
They're so boring.
But Bill liked it. Then he told a story about an old woman and a cat, and the man in the brown hat laughed again.
That's good too. I don't know. How do you remember them all?
The little girl said suddenly. She looked at Bill.
Why did the cat die?
Shh. Be quiet.
Her mother said.
Come and eat your sandwiches now.
That's all right.
Bill said.
I like children.
The man in the brown hat looked at the children's sandwiches.
Mem, I'm hungry too.
He said.
You can get sandwiches in the restaurant on this train.
He looked at Bill.
Let's go down to the restaurant, eh? I need a drink too.
Bill laughed.
You're right. It's thirsty work, telling stories.
The 2 men stood up and left the carriage. The little girl ate her sandwich and looked at Julie.
But why did the cat die?
She asked.
I don't know.
Julie said.
Perhaps it wanted to die.
The little girl came and sat next to Julie.
I like your hair,
she said.
It's beautiful.
Julie looked down at her and smiled. For some minutes it was quiet in the carriage. Then the tall dark man opened his bag and took out a book. He put it on the seat next to him and looked at Julie with a smile. Julie looked back at him and then down at the book. Famous towns of Italy, she read.
Venice, Florence, Rome, Naples. She looked away again, out of the window at the rain. 2 weeks in St. Austell,
she thought.
With Bill. In the rain.
After half an hour, the 2 men came back to the carriage.
There are a lot of people on this train.
Bill said.
Do you want a sandwich, Julie?
No.
She said.
I'm not hungry. You eat them.
The train was nearly at Plymouth. Doors opened and people began to move.
A lot of people get on here.
The man in the brown hat said. The tall dark man stood up and put his book and his newspaper in his bag. Then he picked up his bag and left the carriage. The train stopped at the station. A lot of people got on the train, and 2 women and an old man came into the carriage. They had a lot of bags with them. Bill and the man in the brown hat stood up and helped them. One of the women had a big bag of apples. The bag broke and the apples went all over the carriage.
Oh damn.
she said. Everybody laughed and helped her to find the apples. The train moved away from Plymouth Station. The man in the brown hat laughed very loudly. After a minute or two, everybody sat down and the woman gave some apples to the children.
Where's Julie?
Bill said suddenly.
She's not here.
Perhaps she went to the restaurant.
The man in the brown hat said.
But she wasn't hungry.
Bill said.
She told me.
The little girl looked at Bill.
She got off the train at Plymouth,
she said.
with a tall, dark man. I saw them.
Of course she didn't.
Bill said.
She's on this train. She didn't get off.
Yes, she did.
The children's mother said suddenly. I saw her too. The tall man waited for her on the platform.
He waited for her.
Bill's mouth was open.
But he read his newspaper all the time. He didn't talk to Julie.
Famous towns of Italy. Julie read Venice, Florence, Rome, Naples. And she never talked to him. They didn't say a word.
People don't always need words, young man.
The children's mother said.
But she's my wife.
Bill's face was red and angry.
She can't do that.
He said loudly. He stood up.
I'm going to stop the train.
Everybody looked at him and the two children laughed.
No.
The man in the brown hat said.
No, you don't want to do that. Sit down and eat your sandwiches, my friend.
But I don't understand. Why did she go? What am I going to do?
Bill's face was very unhappy. After a second or two, he sat down again.
What am I going to do?
He said again.
Nothing. The man in the brown hat said. He ate his sandwich slowly. Go and have your holiday in St. Austell. You can have a good time there. Forget about Julie. Those green eyes, now.
He took out a second sandwich and began to eat it.
I knew a woman once with green eyes. She gave me a very bad time. No, you want to forget about Julie.
Chapter 1, Holiday Time. Laura and Max are twins. They live in London with their mom and dad. They always have interesting adventures on holiday. They visit different cities and countries. This summer they are going to stay in a small cottage in the country. The cottage is in a village called Stonecross, near Salisbury. Max and Laura aren't very happy.
Boring,
Says Max. He looks at the map.
the cottage is in the middle of a field. What can't we do in the middle of a field? Why are we going there?
Asks Laura. Their dad is very tired. He says he wants to relax and to sleep a lot. Their mom loves the country. She wants to walk and paint.
It is a very beautiful part of England, she says, full of culture, tradition, mystery.
Mystery?
Say Max and Laura together.
Mystery. Okay, let's go.
Chapter 2, Stonecross. The next day Uncle Stephen and Auntie Barbara arrive. They have lots of suitcases. This year, the two families are going on holiday together. Mom drives her car. Dad sleeps. Dad always sleeps. Uncle Stephen and Auntie Barbara follow in their slow, old car. 2 hours later, they arrive at Stonecross and find their cottage in the middle of a field. There are green hills, beautiful cottages, flowers, sheep and cows everywhere.
It's lovely.
Say Max and Laura.
It's perfect.
Say Mom and Auntie Barbara. Dad says nothing. He is sleeping in the car.
What do you think, Stephen? Do you like it?
Uncle Stephen doesn't answer. He is looking into the distance. His eyes are very black and strange.
What's the matter, Stephen?
Asks Auntie Barbara.
Don't you like the cottage?
Yes. It's wonderful.
He says.
Come on, everyone. Let's take these suitcases inside. Wake up, Andrew.
Dad wakes up.
What? Oh, Eyre, where are we?
We're here at Stonecross. Come and help. We must take the suitcases into the cottage. They take the suitcases and go inside, but Uncle Stephen waits. He wants to talk to his wife.
Barbara, I must tell you something.
He says. His voice is very serious.
This place.
Yes, darling.
This place is in my book. Do you remember? The book I am studying about mysteries.
But Stephen, that book is very old. It's full of strange codes and secret messages.
Exactly. Don't you understand? This is the place where.
Come on, Barbara. Come on, Stephen.
Shouts Mum from the cottage.
We're coming.
Uncle Stephen and Auntie Barbara answer. But when they walk to the cottage, their faces are white. They look very worried. Chapter 3, Mr. Carter and Mrs. Black. The cottage is big. There are 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms upstairs. Downstairs there is a big kitchen, a living room and a study. Uncle Stephen wants to use the study. He must finish some work during the holiday. Uncle Stephen is a historian.
What does Uncle Stephen do exactly?
Laura asks. Her mother replies.
He studies history.
Max is confused.
But I study history too, at school, but it's not my job.
Yes, but Uncle Stephen writes books about history. He thinks about history. He tries to understand the things that no one understands.
For example?
Asks Laura.
Well,
Mum replies.
For example, the mystery of Stonehenge.
So, what about Stonehenge? What is this mystery?
No one really knows. Ask Uncle Stephen. Tomorrow we can go to see it.
Suddenly there is a knock at the door. Mom opens it and an old man comes in. He has white hair and an angry face.
My name's Carter.
He says in an angry voice.
Look after this cottage. Is everything okay? There is wood for the fire in the garden. There are sheets and pillows upstairs. If you have a problem, tell me. Have you got any problems?
Now Mum remembers. Yes, Mr. Carter is the caretaker. He looks after the cottage when no one is staying in it.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. It's very kind of you, but we have no problems.
Mr. Carter wants a problem to solve, so he is not very happy. He goes to the door. Then he stops suddenly, turns around and looks at them.
Mrs. Black is coming.
He says.
Mrs. Black is coming soon. Be careful.
He opens the door and goes out.
What?
Asks Mom.
Who is Mrs. Black?
Asks Max.
And why be careful? Is she dangerous?
Asks Auntie Barbara.
Probably a witch from Stonehenge.
Says Laura. Everyone laughs.
Don't talk about things you don't understand.
Says Uncle Stephen. There is another knock at the door. They all stop. There is silence in the room. Max opens the door. No one speaks,
Hello, everyone,
says a happy voice. A woman comes into the cottage. She is quite old, fat, but she is pretty. She has blue eyes, silver earrings, and a big pink face.
Hello. My name's Mrs. Black.
Mrs. Black is a housekeeper. She helps with the cooking and cleaning. When a family comes for a holiday in the cottage, she helps them. She lives in a different cottage in the village with her son. Mrs. Black is very nice and they start to relax. Later, they eat a big dinner and then say goodbye to their new friend, the housekeeper. They are very tired and soon everyone is sleeping. Everyone but Uncle Stephen. He can't sleep because he is thinking about the book he is studying. Chapter 4. Laura and Max explore the village. On the morning, Laura and Max decide to explore the small village of Stonecross.
Bye. Have a nice time,
says their mother. In the square there is a post office, a baker's, a greengrocer's, a newsagent's, and some other small shops.
Let's buy something to drink in this newsagent's,
says Max.
It's very hot.
A woman is working in the shop. They say,
Good morning,
and smile at the woman, but she does not smile at them. She looks at the twins with cold eyes.
You two aren't from Stonecross. What do you want?
The woman is not very friendly,
Eyre, 2 cans of Coke, please,
says Max.
1.60 pounds.
She gives them 2 cans of Coke and they give her the money. The woman's cold eyes do not change.
Tourists don't usually come to Stonecross.
She says. Her voice is cold too.
It's not a good idea, remember that?
Eyre, yes, okay. Thank you. Eyre Kubi,
says Laura. They run out of the shop very quickly. In the square the sun is shining. Everything is normal again,
Wow, there are some strange people in this village,
says Max. They walk along another street and suddenly a man appears. He is not very old. He is wearing a dark suit and a tie with a strange design on it. The twins stop. The man smiles. He says,
Hello, hello to explorers in Stonecross. Are you on holiday? Are you having a nice time?
Yes, yes, thank you.
replies Laura.
My name's Martin Knight. What are your names?
Max and Laura Merrill.
They say together. Sometimes twins understand what the other is thinking. Sometimes they speak together.
Merrill. Is your father the famous historian, Stephen Merrill?
No. He's our uncle, not our father. He's on holiday with us in Stonecross. Do you know him?
The man doesn't answer Max's question.
I see. Stephen Merrill is here in Stonecross. Very interesting. And tell me, what is he studying at the moment?
Oh, a really old book about mysteries and secret. Sorry, Mr. Knight, but it's very late. We must go home and have lunch.
Laura stops him.
Come on, Max, it's time to go.
Can we meet tomorrow?
Says Martin Knight.
You can tell me about your uncle's old book.
Okay.
Says Max.
Come on, Max.
Says Laura, and the twins go back along the road.
Sorry, Max, but I don't like that man.
Explains Laura.
He wants to know about Uncle Stephen and his hooks. But Uncle Stephen is very famous. Lots of people want to know about him. I know, but this man is different. I can't explain why. Not everyone is strange in Stonecross. Think of Mrs. Black. She's a nice, normal woman. Yes, you're right. Sorry. But now it's 1:45 and we must go home.
Chapter 5, A Visit to Stonehenge. When the twins get home, everyone is waiting for them. Mrs. Black is there too.
What do you think of our little village?
She asks.
The village is lovely, yet some of the people are strange.
Replies Laura. Mrs. Black laughs.
I know. Don't worry about the people. They don't see many tourists. Not many people come to Stonecross.
Are you ready to go to Stonehenge this afternoon?
Asks Auntie Barbara. Mrs. Black says.
You're going to Stonehenge. It's nothing special. A circle of old stones. That's all.
Stonehenge is near the village of Stonecross. They take the cars and in 20 minutes they are there. Laura suddenly shouts.
Look, there it is. There it is.
And down in the valley they see Mrs. Black's circle of old stones.
It's spectacular,
says Uncle Stephen.
It's incredible,
says Mom.
It's magnificent,
says Auntie Barbara.
Wow.
Says Laura.
It's not very big,
says Max.
Shut up, Max,
says everyone.
Andrew, what do you think? Do you like Stonehenge? Andrew?
Dad doesn't answer. He is sleeping in the car.
Andrew, wake up now.
This time Mom is very angry. Around the stones there is a fence. People can't touch them, but they can go very near and take photographs.
Let's get an audio guide,
suggests Mom.
You listen and it tells you the story of Stonehenge.
Everyone gets an audio guide and they start to walk around the enormous stone circle. Uncle Stephen walks in the opposite direction and looks at his old book of mysteries. He reads something and then looks at the stones. Then he walks away. He looks at the hills and the trees near the stones.
3 hills around the stones. Yes, it is a type of triangle,
he says to himself. Then he looks at the stones again. Uncle Stephen is thinking. Half an hour later, the others return.
Stonehenge is fantastic,
they say, but Uncle Stephen is not listening. He is reading his book again and looking at the stones and the hills around them.
Time for something to drink,
says Mom. They all walk to the small cave near the tourist shop.
Come on, Stephen. Are you coming with us?
Finally, Uncle Stephen puts his book in his bag and follows the others. Chapter 6, A Thief. The family finally gets back to the cottage. Everyone is very happy, but they are also tired. The sun is shining and everything seems in perfect order. They park the cars and go to the cottage.
That's strange,
says Dad.
I can't move the key. I can't open the door.
Let's try the other door,
Mom says. They walk to the small door at the back of the cottage. Suddenly everyone stops. The door is open,
Impossible,
says Laura.
Only Mrs. Black has got a key.
Mom and Auntie Barbara scream.
Thieves,
they say. Inside the cottage there is chaos. The cupboards are empty, the drawers are open and things are on the floor.
Our money,
says Dad.
My jewelry,
says Mom. Uncle Stephen says.
What's missing? We must phone the police.
They look in all the rooms, but nothing is missing.
Look, our money is here. The thief doesn't want money,
says Dad happily.
And look, my jewelry is here. He doesn't want my diamond ring,
says Mom.
So why? What is interesting for a thief here?
Asks Max. Uncle Stephen's face is very serious.
I think I know the answer to that question. This is what the thief wants,
he says, and takes the hook of mysteries from his bag.
That old book. But why?
Asks Max.
I am studying the mystery of Stonehenge. Some people think that it is an ancient computer.
Uncle Stephen explains,
I don't understand.
says Laura.
Ancient people understand lots of things that we don't understand now. Things about the stars, about energy, mathematics, and communication. We think that Stonehenge is an enormous computer. It connects information to other ancient computers around the world.
Like the pyramids,
says Laura excitedly.
Exactly. Perhaps these computers communicate with spacemen too.
Wow,
says Max. Uncle Stephen continues.
My old book of mysteries has a secret code, but there's a symbol I don't understand. I want to understand the symbol because I want to understand Stonehenge. This computer can be very dangerous because bad people can use the information. We must protect the book. Do you understand?
Ease,
They all reply.
Now, let's tidy the house. Everyone must keep their eyes and ears open.
Ease,
They all reply. The twins are tidying the house. Suddenly Laura stops and says,
Max, look, what do you think this is?
She gives her brother a small silver object. It is round with a triangle and a strange cross in the middle.
It's got a pin at the back. It's a brooch. Yes, perhaps it belongs to the thief. Let's give it to Uncle Stephen.
They tell their uncle the story and he looks at the small object. He puts it in his desk and his face is serious. He doesn't say anything. Max and Laura go into the living room.
There's something strange about that object, Laura,
says Max. I know that symbol,
Ease,
says Laura.
me too. I recognize it, but where from?
Chapter 7, A Noisy Night. At 7 o'clock Mrs. Black arrives. She helps cook the dinner and listens to the story.
Terrible.
She says,
Every summer there are thieves in Stonecross. They know there are lots of tourists, you see.
But you say that tourists don't come here.
answers Laura.
Ah, yes, Eyre, well, it depends. Some summers there are a lot, some summers there aren't a lot.
Suddenly a telephone rings. It is Mrs. Black's mobile phone.
Excuse me.
She says and smiles at everyone. She goes to the hall and speaks in a soft voice.
Yes, okay, don't worry. Everything's all right. I don't know, perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow night. Okay, bye. My son.
She explains.
He's 27 and he doesn't know how to cook. Can you believe it?
Mom laughs.
I'm sure he prefers your wonderful cooking.
Later that evening everyone is playing cards together. Mom is winning. She always wins. Mrs. Black says,
Who wants a nice cup of hot chocolate?
During the evening and at night it is cold in the house. They say,
Yes, please, Mrs. Black.
but Laura says.
No, thank you.
The housekeeper seems offended.
Why not?
She asks angrily.
Hot chocolate helps you sleep.
I can sleep with no problems, thank you.
Replies Laura. Mrs. Black is not very happy, but goes to the kitchen to make hot chocolate for the others. It is creamy, chocolatey and delicious.
This is wonderful, Mrs. Black. What is the special ingredient? Do you have a secret recipe?
Asks Mom.
It's my grandmother's secret recipe.
She says and laughs. She says good night and goes home. Soon, everyone is very sleepy and goes to bed. Only Laura isn't tired. It is the middle of the night. Outside, the sky is full of stars but there is no moon. Everyone is sleeping. Mom is dreaming and Dad is snoring. Suddenly Laura sits up in her bed. There is a noise. Someone is downstairs. She relaxes. It is probably her father. He sometimes gets up and sleepwalks, but no, she can hear her father. He is snoring in his bedroom. She gets up very quietly. Yes, there is someone. The noise is in the study. She goes downstairs. She is very quiet. When she is outside the study, she stops and listens. She hears the sound of paper.
I must be brave.
She says and pushes the door open quietly.
Stop, thief!
She shouts, but to her surprise she sees Mrs. Black. She is sitting at Uncle Stephen's desk reading his notebooks.
Oh, Mrs. Black, it's you,
says Laura.
Eyre, hello, Laura. I can't find my car keys. Perhaps they are here. I don't want to disturb everyone.
Oh, right,
says Laura, but then she remembers Mrs. Black hasn't got a car. At that moment, Dad and Uncle Stephen arrive. They think there is another thief. Dad smiles and laughs.
Phew. It's Mrs. Black. Hello, Mrs. Black, you're working late tonight.
Uncle Stephen doesn't laugh.
What are you doing in my study, Mrs. Black?
He asks. She tells him the story of the car keys. Uncle Stephen replies,
Tomorrow we can all look for the keys together. Now it's time to sleep. Good night, Mrs. Black.
He opens the door and the housekeeper goes out. She doesn't look at Uncle Stephen when she says,
Good night, everyone.
Chapter 8. Now I remember. For 2 or 3 days everything is normal and everyone is happy. Mrs. Black says her son has got the car keys and they aren't lost after all. Laura looks at Mrs. Black but decides not to say anything. On Wednesday afternoon, Mom and Dad go walking. Dad wants to sleep, but Mom says,
No, Andrew. You can't sleep all holiday.
All right.
He replies, but he is not very happy.
What about you, Stephen? Come with us.
No, thank you. I must work.
Auntie Barbara laughs and says to Mom,
Sarah, your husband sleeps all the time and my husband works all the time.
Don't laugh, Barbara,
replies Uncle Stephen.
My work is very important.
Everyone laughs. Sometimes Uncle Stephen is very funny.
Today, I want to work a lot. Please don't disturb me,
he says and goes to the study.
Can I come with you too?
Asks Auntie Barbara.
Of course.
They reply. They all put on their walking boots and say goodbye to the twins.
Max and Laura decide to explore a different part of the village. In the village there is a small hill. It is a strange shape and on the top there is a stone cross.
The village probably has the name Stone Cross because there is a stone cross on the hill,
says Laura.
Very clever, Charlotte,
says her brother. They look up to the cross on the hill. 2 people are talking near it. The sun is behind them and the twins can't see very well.
Who are those 2 people?
They ask together.
Mrs. Black and Martin Knight. Let's go and listen,
says Max.
No, Max,
says Laura.
We mustn't listen to.
Suddenly she stops. Her face is white.
Max, now I remember.
Max's face is white too. He remembers the same thing.
I know, me too. The symbol. Yes, I know where it comes from. Yes, Mrs. Black's earrings. It's the same symbol. What? I remember it from Martin Knight's tie. What? This means Mrs. Black and Martin Knight know the thief.
Perhaps one of them is the thief. Do you remember Mrs. Black reading Uncle
Stephen's notebook? Do you remember Martin Knight's questions? What can we do? Come on, Laura, follow me.
says Max. They start to go up the hill, but Mrs. Black and Martin Knight aren't there.
We are too late. Where are they now?
Says Laura.
I don't know.
Answers Max.
Come on. Let's go home and tell Uncle Stephen what we know.
They start to walk home, but on the hill 2 dark shadows are watching them from behind the stone cross. Chapter 9. Uncle Stephen Understands. Uncle Stephen is happy. Finally he can work in peace. He makes a cup of tea and goes into his study. On his desk there is the old book of mysteries and the silver brooch with the strange symbol. He takes the brooch in his hand and looks at it. He knows it is part of the mystery. But how? The circle is similar to Stonehenge. The triangle is similar to the hills around it. But what does the cross mean? Uncle Stephen recognizes the symbol, but where from? He drinks some more tea. He thinks. He looks out of the window. From the window he can see the strange hill in the village and the strange stone cross on the top of it.
Wait a minute.
He thinks.
The strange stone cross.
He looks at the brooch. Yes, it's the same. He quickly turns to a page in his old book of mysteries. He reads something and shouts, "Yes. Now I understand. Now I understand. I must telephone Professor Johnson in London." He takes the phone and calls the number.
Hello, Professor, it's Stephen Merrill here. Listen, we must meet. Can I bring the book to you in London? It's not safe here. There's a train at 5 o'clock this evening. It gets to London at 7 o'clock, yes. See you at the station, goodbye and thank you.
He puts the phone down and picks up his cup of tea.
I'm sure that tea's cold now,
says a cold voice behind him. He turns quickly and sees the shadow of Mrs. Black in the door.
What are you doing here?
He asks angrily.
You don't work today. What do you want?
Mrs. Black's earrings shine in the sun.
You know what I want, Merrill.
She says.
Give me that book.
Chapter 10. A Doctor's Visit. Max and Laura play near a river for some time, but later go back to the cottage. Everything is quiet. They don't have a key, so they knock on the door. Nobody answers. They knock again and Mrs. Black answers the door. She is wearing an apron and she has a rolling pin in her hand. She says,
Hello, children. I'm making a delicious chocolate cake for lunch. Your Uncle Stephen doesn't feel very well. Your parents aren't here, and I want to help.
What do you mean? Uncle Stephen's fine,
says Max.
He has a headache and a temperature.
Mrs. Black replies.
He works too hard. This is very strange. Uncle Stephen is never ill.
Max and Laura don't believe the housekeeper.
I want to talk to my uncle,
says Laura.
Me too,
says Max. Mrs. Black is a big woman. She stands in the door and the twins can't pass.
It's not a good idea.
She tells them.
Your uncle is upstairs. He's resting.
I want to see my uncle. Now,
repeats Laura.
You can't see him. There is a doctor with him now,
Mrs. Black shouts. Laura pushes the woman and she falls to the floor. Max runs past her too. They go to the study, but their uncle is not there. They run upstairs.
Uncle Stephen, are you all right?
Shouts Laura, but there is no answer. Max opens the bedroom door. Uncle Stephen is lying on the bed. He cannot move his arms or legs because there is a rope around them. There is a big hump on his head and his eyes are closed.
Is he dead?
Asks Laura in a frightened voice.
No, he's sleeping.
Max replies.
Look, he's breathing.
Yes, he's sleeping,
says a familiar voice. They look up and see a man in the room.
Martin Knight.
They say together.
Oh, yes.
He laughs.
Your uncle is sleeping. Now we can take his book and discover the secret of the stones. Now no one can stop us, especially two stupid children.
At that moment, Mrs. Black arrives.
I see you know my son,
she says. She is holding the rolling pin. Suddenly, Max understands what she wants to do.
Quick, Laura!
He pushes his sister to the floor. The rolling pin misses Laura's head. Max jumps up. He tries to take the rolling pin from Mrs. Black. Laura gets up and starts to run away. Martin Knight tries to stop her, but she is very fast. Suddenly outside, they hear the sound of a siren. It is a police car.
Quick, the police!
Shouts Martin. He and Mrs. Black run. When they arrive at the door, there are two policemen waiting for them. They put handcuffs on the two criminals and push them into the police van. Laura telephones for an ambulance for Uncle Stephen. Max speaks to the policeman.
Thank you,
he says.
but I don't understand why.
He stops. Under a tree in the garden, he sees an old man.
Mr. Carter.
Mr. Carter comes and talks to Max.
Remember, Hoy, you must tell me your problems.
He says.
I know these people. I know this place. I know when there's a problem.
Thank you,
says Max.
You're welcome.
The old man smiles. Chapter 11. The Secret of the Stones. The next day, everyone is at the hospital. Uncle Stephen is in bed. The doctor says that there is only one problem: the big bump on Uncle Stephen's head. Uncle Stephen opens his eyes.
Hello, Barbara. What day is it?
It's Thursday, darling.
Oh, hello, Andrew. Hello, everyone. What are you doing here? Don't you have school today, children?
it's the summer holiday.
Laura replies.
We're in Stonecross, remember?
Says Max.
Stonecross? Holiday? No, I don't remember. We're in London, I think.
Uncle Stephen doesn't remember. He doesn't remember about the holiday, about Mrs. Black and Martin Knight, and, most important of all, he doesn't remember about the secret of the stones.
You remember the symbol, the brooch, the old book of mysteries?
They ask him. He smiles and says,
No, sorry.
A policeman arrives. He tells them that the two criminals, Martin Smith and his mother, Dorothy Smith, are part of a secret organization.
The name of the organization is the Black Knights.
He says.
They want to find the secret of Stonehenge and use the secret to become rich and powerful. Mr. Merrill is the only person who knows the secret and...
But I don't know the secret,
says Uncle Stephen.
I'm sorry, everyone, but I can't remember.
Perhaps it's the best thing.
Says Auntie Barbara.
The stones can keep their 5,000-year-old secret. It's not right to take it from them now.
Everyone agrees.
Perhaps we can find another secret next holiday.
Say Max and Laura together.
Perhaps next holiday I can stay in London,
says Uncle Stephen. He rubs the bump on his head. Poor Uncle Stephen. Everybody laughs.
No more adventures this summer.
Says Max.
But perhaps at Christmas.
Says Laura.
Who knows?